Maybe cleaning floors is still too complicated for you. The words cut through the grand ballroom of the Whitmore Grand Hotel like a knife across glass, and the laughter that followed was quiet but sharp enough to make several guests turn their heads. Richard Caldwell, the hotel manager, stood with his arms crossed beside a marble pillar, his polished shoes reflecting the golden chandelier light above. In front of him, holding a damp cloth that smelled faintly of lemon disinfectant, stood Lena Brooks, the housekeeper he had just called out in front of a room full of very important guests. A thin trail of water stretched across the polished floor near the buffet table, where champagne glasses sparkled beneath warm light. Lena knelt carefully and wiped the spot again, though she had already cleaned it once. The ballroom buzzed with soft music and polite conversation, but the moment Caldwell spoke, everything slowed. A few guests leaned closer to watch. Others pretended not to notice. Lena did not respond. She simply pressed the cloth against the floor and moved it slowly in a wide circle until the marble shone again. The scent of cleaning liquid mixed with roasted salmon and buttered rolls drifting from the banquet tables. Her uniform sleeves were rolled neatly to her elbows, revealing strong wrists marked by years of quiet work. Caldwell gave a short laugh that sounded rehearsed. He gestured toward the shining floor as if presenting a stage trick. "There," he said loudly enough for nearby tables to hear. "Was that so hard?" Lena rose slowly, folding the cloth once in her hands. She kept her eyes lowered, but inside her chest her heartbeat thudded like distant drums. The Whitmore Grand Hotel had been her workplace for 7 years. She had polished its hallways before sunrise and vacuumed its carpets long after midnight banquets ended. Tonight was no different, except for the crowd. The hotel was hosting a luxury investors gala, and every chandelier blazed like a small sun above the guests. Caldwell adjusted his tie and turned back toward the gathering as if the moment were nothing. But several people were still watching Lena. One elderly gentleman near the back table had not laughed at all. He studied her quietly, fingers resting on the edge of his wine glass, his expression unreadable beneath silver hair and thoughtful eyes. Before continuing, comment where in the world you're watching from, and make sure to subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you cannot miss. Now back to the story. Lena stepped aside from the center of the ballroom and moved toward the service corridor, carrying the damp cloth in both hands. Her shoes made soft tapping sounds against the marble floor as she walked. Behind her the music rose again and conversations returned, but the air still felt heavy with something unspoken. She passed a table where a small girl sat swinging her legs beneath a white linen tablecloth while her father spoke with another guest. The child watched Lena curiously, her bright eyes following the quiet housekeeper across the room. Lena offered the girl a small smile before continuing toward the hallway that led to the staff area. She had nearly reached the doorway when Caldwell's voice rang out again across the ballroom. "Housekeeping," he called sharply. Lena stopped. Slowly she turned back toward the room, unaware that within the next few minutes the night would change in a way that none of the guests in that glittering ballroom could have imagined. Lena stood still near the service corridor doorway, the damp cloth folded quietly in her hands as the soft music returned to the ballroom behind her. The air felt heavier now, as though the room itself had noticed the tension that lingered after the manager's voice echoed across the marble floor. Slowly she turned back toward the center of the ballroom, where Richard Caldwell stood with one hand resting on the back of a velvet chair. His expression carried the same thin smile that had made so many employees lower their eyes over the years. Several guests had resumed their conversations, yet their glances drifted toward Lena again, curious, amused, or simply uncomfortable. The golden chandeliers above reflected in the polished marble floor like small suns, and every step she took toward Caldwell felt louder than it should have. The faint scent of roasted salmon and fresh bread still drifted through the room, mixing with the sharper smell of cleaning liquid that clung to her cloth. Caldwell lifted his chin slightly as she approached, as though calling a student to the front of a classroom. "Did you forget something, Lena?" he asked with a calm voice that carried farther than he probably intended. A few nearby guests paused again, forks hovering above there. Plates. Lena kept her posture straight and answered quietly, "No, sir. I was heading back to the service hall." Caldwell looked down at the spotless marble floor and then back at her. "Interesting," he said slowly, "because I still see streaks." He gestured toward a spot near the edge of the buffet table where a faint reflection of chandelier light shimmered across the surface. The floor was already perfectly clean, but Lena walked back toward it anyway and knelt again, pressing the cloth gently across the marble. Her movements were calm and precise, practiced from years of doing the same quiet work long before the guests arrived and long after they left. The cloth slid across the floor with a soft whispering sound. Somewhere behind her, a glass clinked against another glass, and laughter rose again from a nearby table, though it sounded thinner this time. Across the ballroom, the elderly gentleman who had been watching earlier leaned slightly forward in his chair. His silver eyebrows lowered as he studied the scene more carefully now. He had not touched his wine. His attention remained on Lena. Near his table, the small girl who had noticed Lena earlier slid down from her chair and wandered a few steps away while her father continued speaking with another guest. The girl walked slowly across the carpeted edge of the ballroom until she reached the marble floor near the buffet table. Lena noticed the child first when she saw the small reflection of the girl's shoes in the polished marble beside her hand. The girl looked up at her with wide, curious eyes. "Hi," the child said softly, her voice barely louder than the music drifting through the room. Lena paused for a moment and smiled gently. "Hello there," she answered. The girl pointed toward the shining floor. "My dad says this hotel is the fanciest place we have ever been." Lena gave a small nod while finishing the last slow circle with the cloth. "It is a beautiful place," she said, "but the best part of any place is the people inside it." The girl considered that for a moment with a serious expression that children sometimes have when they are thinking very hard about something new. Then she smiled. Just then a waiter passed quickly behind them, carrying a tray of sparkling water glasses. One glass shifted near the edge of the tray and tipped sideways. The waiter caught it just before it could fall, but a splash of water spilled across the marble floor only a few feet away from Lena. The thin stream of water slid quickly across the polished surface toward the edge of the carpet. Caldwell saw it immediately and gave a sharp sigh that carried across the room. "Unbelievable," he said loudly. "Another mess." The waiter froze, clearly embarrassed, but Lena had already moved forward with the cloth. She wiped the water away before it could spread further. When she rose again, the marble floor reflected the chandelier light perfectly once more. The small girl clapped her hands softly in approval. Several guests nearby smiled at the child reaction, and even the elderly gentleman allowed the faintest hint of amusement to cross his face. Caldwell, however, did not smile. His eyes narrowed slightly as he watched Lena stand again with the folded cloth in her hands. For a moment, he said nothing. The ballroom music continued, the guests returned to their meals, and the evening seemed ready to move on. Yet across the room, the silver-haired gentleman slowly reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and removed a small phone. He glanced once more at Lena before quietly pressing a call button. When the person on the other end answered, the gentleman spoke in a low, steady voice that carried a quiet authority. "You may want to come down to the ballroom," he said. "There is something here that you should see." He ended the call without another word and returned the phone to his pocket, while Lena turned once again toward the service corridor, unaware that the quiet phone call had already set something important in motion. The service corridor doors closed softly behind Lena as she stepped into the quieter hallway that ran along the edge of the grand ballroom. The sound of music and polite laughter faded into a distant murmur, replaced by the steady hum of air vents and the faint rattling of a rolling cart somewhere deeper in the staff area. Fluorescent ceiling lights cast a cooler glow than the golden chandeliers in the ballroom, and the polished marble floor here was interrupted by long strips of gray carpet designed to soften the noise of staff moving quickly during busy events. Lena walked slowly, still holding the folded cloth in her hands. Her breathing had finally begun to steady after the tension of the past few minutes, but the echo of Richard Caldwell's voice still lingered in her mind. She had worked at the Whitmore Grand Hotel for 7 years and moments like that were not new. Managers changed, guests came and went, but the quiet rhythm of her work rarely did. She wiped tables, polished floors, and prepared the rooms that others would later fill with celebration. She had learned long ago that silence was often the safest response. Ahead of her, a supply cart stood beside an open service closet. Bottles of cleaning solution lined the metal shelves, their sharp citrus scent drifting through the hallway. Lena set the cloth down on the edge of the cart and reached for a fresh towel, folding it carefully the way she always did, corner over corner until it formed a neat square. The routine helped calm her thoughts. Behind the ballroom wall, the music swelled again as the band began another slow jazz melody. Somewhere a group of guests applauded politely. Life inside the gala continued as if nothing had happened. Yet inside the ballroom, the elderly gentleman who had made the quiet phone call had not taken his eyes off the service corridor doors since Lena disappeared through them. He sat still for several moments, listening as conversations returned around him. A waiter approached to refill his water glass, but the gentleman lifted a hand gently. "No, thank you," he said with a quiet voice that carried a calm authority. The waiter nodded and moved on. At a nearby table, the small girl who had spoken with Lena earlier had climbed back in her chair beside her father. "Dad," she said softly, tugging at his sleeve. The cleaning lady was nice. Her father glanced toward the service corridor doors for a moment before answering. "Yes," he said thoughtfully. "She seemed very kind." The girl nodded with a satisfied smile before returning to the dessert on her plate. Across the ballroom, Richard Caldwell continued moving among the guests with the polished confidence of a man who believed he controlled every detail of the evening. He stopped beside a group of investors near the center table and laughed at something one of them said. The earlier moment with Lena already seemed forgotten in his mind, yet from time to time his eyes flicked toward the corridor where she had disappeared, as though checking that the disruption had truly passed. In the service hallway, Lena finished folding the towel and placed it neatly on the cart. A younger housekeeper named Rosa pushed another cart around the corner and slowed when she saw Lena standing there. "You all right?" Rosa asked quietly. Lena gave a small nod. "I am fine," she replied gently. Rosa hesitated, then lowered her voice even more. "He should not talk to you like that in front of everyone." Lena shrugged slightly, though the faint tightness in her shoulders betrayed the effort to remain calm. "It is a busy night," she said. "Sometimes people speak without thinking." Rosa did not look convinced, but she said nothing more. The two women worked side by side for a moment in the quiet hallway, arranging towels and wiping down the edges of the cart shelves. Back in the ballroom, the silver-haired gentleman checked his watch once before looking again toward the main entrance doors at the far end of the room. His expression remained calm, but there was patience in his posture, as though he knew something others did not. Several minutes passed. The music shifted into another melody, and a ripple of conversation filled the hall once more. Then suddenly the large entrance doors at the far end of the ballroom opened. A rush of cooler evening air drifted briefly across the marble floor as a tall figure stepped inside the doorway. A few guests nearest the entrance turned their heads in mild curiosity. The silver-haired gentleman did not move at all. Instead, he simply watched the new arrival cross the threshold of the Whitmore Grand Hotel ballroom, while the quiet chain of events that had begun with a single phone call slowly started to unfold. The tall figure who stepped through the ballroom doors paused for a moment just inside the entrance, allowing his eyes to adjust to the warm glow of the chandeliers above. The night air that followed him inside carried a faint trace of rain and city asphalt, a sharp contrast to the rich scent of food and polished wood that filled the Whitmore Grand Hotel ballroom. Conversations softened as several guests near the doorway recognized the man immediately. His posture was calm and steady, the kind of quiet confidence that did not need to announce itself. Daniel Whitmore walked forward slowly, his dark suit catching the chandelier light as he crossed the marble floor. A few guests rose politely from their chairs as he passed, while others whispered quietly to the people beside them. The name Whitmore carried weight inside the hotel walls. After all, the building itself stood because of the Whitmore family. Across the room, Richard Caldwell turned his head when he noticed the subtle shift in the crowd. For a moment, confusion crossed his face. Then his expression changed quickly into something more polished and respectful. He adjusted his jacket and moved toward the entrance with quick steps, his voice already forming the welcoming tone he used for important visitors. "Mr. Whitmore," Caldwell said as he approached, offering a firm handshake and a practiced smile. "What a pleasant surprise. We were not expecting you tonight." Daniel Whitmore returned the handshake briefly, though his eyes were already scanning the ballroom. "Good evening, Richard," he replied in a calm voice that carried easily through the nearby tables. "I heard the gala was going well." Caldwell nodded eagerly. "Very well. Our guests are extremely pleased. Everything is running smoothly." Daniel gave a small nod, though his gaze drifted across the room as if searching for something specific. The silver-haired gentleman who had made the earlier phone call remained seated at his table, watching quietly as the two men spoke. When Daniel's eyes met his for a moment, the gentleman gave a small, knowing nod. It was enough. Daniel turned his attention back to Caldwell. "I'm glad to hear it," he said, "but I received a call that suggested there may have been a small disturbance." Caldwell blinked once, clearly surprised. "A disturbance?" he repeated with a short laugh. "Nothing serious at all. Just a minor housekeeping issue that was already resolved." Daniel's expression did not change, though his eyes sharpened slightly. "Housekeeping," he said thoughtfully, as though considering the word carefully. "And where's the employee involved?" Caldwell shifted his weight slightly, his smile tightening just a little. "She returned to the service corridor," he answered quickly. "One of our housekeepers. A reliable worker, but sometimes these things happen during busy events." Daniel studied Caldwell for a moment longer, then nodded slowly. "I see." Behind them the band continued playing, though the melody now felt softer as several nearby guests leaned closer to listen. At the service corridor down the hall, Lena Brooks was wiping the edge of a stainless steel supply cart, while Rosa stacked fresh towels beside her. The quiet rhythm of work continued there, far removed from the polished conversations in the ballroom. Lena moved the cloth slowly across the metal surface until it shone beneath the fluorescent lights. She had not heard the ballroom doors open. She had not seen the arrival that was already changing the atmosphere of the evening. Back inside the ballroom, Daniel Whitmore finally turned his full attention toward the corridor doors across the marble floor. His gaze lingered there for several seconds. "I would like to speak with her," he said calmly. Caldwell opened his mouth to respond, but Daniel continued before he could. "Now." The word was not loud, but it carried a quiet certainty that left little room for discussion. Caldwell hesitated for the briefest moment before nodding. "Of course," he said quickly, though a trace of unease flickered behind his polite smile. He turned toward the corridor and gestured to a nearby waiter. "Please ask housekeeping to send Lena Brooks back to the ballroom immediately." The waiter nodded and hurried toward the service hallway. As the young employee disappeared through the corridor doors, the silver-haired gentleman leaned back in his chair and folded his hands calmly in his lap. Around the room, guests continued to whisper quietly, sensing that something unusual was unfolding beneath the elegant surface of the gala. Daniel Whitmore remained standing near the center of the ballroom, his gaze fixed on the corridor entrance where Lena Brooks would soon reappear, unaware that the quiet moment she had endured earlier was about to become something far larger than she could have imagined. The service corridor doors opened quietly as the young waiter stepped inside, his polished shoes slowing against the gray carpet while he searched the hallway. The fluorescent lights hummed softly above the cleaning carts lined against the wall. Lena Brooks stood near one of the carts, wiping the edge of stainless steel shelf with a careful motion that had become second nature over the years. Rosa was stacking folded towels beside her when the waiter approached. He looked slightly nervous, glancing between the two housekeepers before speaking. "Miss Brooks," he said politely, "the manager asked for you to return to the ballroom." Lena paused, with the cloth in her hand. For a brief moment she thought she had misheard. "Return to the ballroom?" she asked gently. The waiter nodded. "Yes, ma'am. Right away." Rosa looked at Lena with quiet concern. "What does he want now?" she whispered once the waiter stepped back toward the corridor door. Lena gave a small, uncertain shrug. "I do not know," she answered softly. She folded the cloth once more and placed it neatly on the cart before smoothing the sleeves of her uniform. The faint smell of citrus cleaner still clung to her hands. She took a slow breath and began walking toward the corridor doors. Each step echoed slightly louder than before. The waiter pushed the doors open for her, and the warm golden light of the ballroom spilled into the hallway again. The music drifted outward, smooth and steady, as though nothing unusual had happened. Lena stepped through the doorway and immediately felt dozens of eyes turn toward her. The grand ballroom looked exactly the same as it had minutes earlier, yet the atmosphere had changed in a way she could not quite explain. Conversations softened as she walked across the marble floor. The polished surface reflected the chandeliers above like scattered stars beneath her feet. At the center of the room stood Richard Caldwell, beside a tall man Lena recognized instantly, even though she had only seen him from a distance before. Daniel Whitmore, the owner of the hotel, the man whose name was engraved on the building itself. Lena slowed slightly, unsure why she had been called back into the middle of the gala. Caldwell cleared his throat and gestured toward her with a polite smile that looked forced. "Ah, here she is," he said. "Mr. Whitmore, this is Lena Brooks from housekeeping." Lena stopped several feet away and lowered her eyes respectfully. "Good evening, sir," she said quietly. Daniel Whitmore studied her for a moment before speaking. His gaze was calm but focused, as though he were examining something important that others had overlooked. "Good evening, Lena," he replied in a steady voice. Around them, several guests leaned closer to listen. The silver-haired gentleman at the nearby table watched with silent interest. Caldwell stepped forward quickly, eager to control the moment. "As I explained earlier," he said to Daniel with a smooth tone, "there was a small housekeeping issue during the event. Miss Brooks handled it, and everything has already been resolved." Lena remained still, unsure if she should speak or remain silent. Daniel Whitmore did not take his eyes off her. "Is that correct?" he asked gently. Lena hesitated only briefly. "Yes, sir," she answered. "There was a little water on the floor, but it has been cleaned." Caldwell nodded quickly, as if to confirm the explanation. "Exactly," he said. "Nothing serious at all." Daniel Whitmore seemed to consider that answer carefully. The ballroom had grown noticeably quieter now. Even the band had softened its playing as the musicians sensed the shift in attention. Daniel finally took a step forward, closing the distance between himself and Lena. His voice remained calm. "And earlier this evening," he said slowly, "did anything else happen here that you think I should know about?" Lena felt the weight of the room pressing around her. Dozens of faces watched her silently. For a moment, she considered simply repeating what Caldwell had said and letting the evening move on. That had always been the easiest path. But before she could answer, the silver-haired gentleman rose from his chair and spoke clearly from across the room. "Yes," he said with quiet firmness. "Something did happen." Every head in the ballroom turned toward him. The gentleman stepped away from his table and walked slowly across the marble floor until he stood beside Daniel Whitmore. Then he looked directly at Lena. "Miss Brooks," he said kindly, "earlier tonight you were doing your job, and someone here decided to make a spectacle of it." The room fell completely silent as the truth that had been hanging quietly in the air all evening finally began to surface. The silence that followed the silver-haired gentleman's words spread slowly across the ballroom, like a ripple moving across still water. Every conversation stopped. Even the musicians lowered their instruments as the attention of the entire room shifted toward the small circle forming near the center of the marble floor. Lena Brooks stood quietly with her hands folded in front of her uniform, unsure whether she should remain where she was or step away. Richard Caldwell felt the change immediately. The polite confidence he had worn earlier began to fade, replaced by a tight stiffness in his shoulders. He forced a small laugh that sounded thinner than before. "I believe there may be some misunderstanding," Caldwell said quickly, glancing toward Daniel Whitmore. "Our guest here might have misinterpreted the situation." The silver-haired gentleman did not react to the interruption. Instead, he looked calmly at Lena, his voice warm but steady. "Miss Brooks," he said gently, Earlier you were simply doing your work, cleaning a spill before anyone could slip. I watched the entire moment. Lena shifted her weight slightly, but kept her gaze lowered. She had never enjoyed being the center of attention, and now dozens of guests were watching every movement she made. Daniel Whitmore turned his head slowly toward Caldwell. "You said there was only a small housekeeping issue," he said evenly. Caldwell nodded quickly. "Yes, sir. That is correct." The gentleman beside him gave a quiet shake of his head. "That is not what happened," he said. His voice carried clearly across the silent room. "What happened was that a hard-working employee was mocked in front of guests for doing exactly what she was hired to do." A murmur moved through the surrounding tables. Several people who had witnessed the earlier moment exchanged uncomfortable glances. Caldwell opened his mouth again, but Daniel raised one hand slightly, signaling for him to wait. Then Daniel looked back at Lena. "Miss Brooks," he said calmly, "you may speak freely. No one here will interrupt you." Lena hesitated. Her fingers tightened slightly against the fabric of her uniform sleeve. For years, she had learned that speaking less often made problems disappear faster. Yet the entire room was now waiting for her answer. She took a quiet breath before responding. "There was water on the floor near the buffet table," she said softly. "I cleaned it. That is all." The silver-haired gentleman nodded. "And after that?" he asked kindly. Lena paused again. She did not wish to embarrass anyone, even the manager who had spoken harshly to her. "The manager asked me to clean it again," she said. "He wanted to make sure the floor looked perfect for the guests." Caldwell quickly stepped forward. "Exactly," he said, seizing the moment. "A matter of presentation. Nothing more." But the gentleman's voice remained calm. "That is not what I heard," he said quietly. He turned toward Daniel Whitmore. "What I heard was the manager telling this woman that cleaning floors might be too complicated for her." The words hung in the air like a dropped glass. Several guests shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. Daniel Whitmore's expression did not change, but his eyes slowly returned to Caldwell. "Did you say that?" he asked. Caldwell felt the weight of the room pressing down on him now. The confident smile he had worn earlier had disappeared completely. "I may have said something similar," he admitted carefully, "but it was only a joke. A light comment during a busy evening." The silver-haired gentleman folded his hands behind his back. "It did not sound like a joke," he said. And the room did not laugh because it was funny. They laughed because they were uncomfortable. The silence deepened again. Lena felt a quiet tension building around her, though she still did not fully understand why Daniel Whitmore seemed so interested in the moment. The owner of the hotel studied her for several seconds longer. Then he asked one simple question. "How long have you worked here, Lena?" She answered softly without looking up. 7 years, sir." Daniel Whitmore nodded slowly, as though confirming something in his mind. Around them the guests remained completely still, sensing that the evening had quietly turned in a direction no one had expected. The silver-haired gentleman glanced once toward the ballroom doors, then back to Daniel Whitmore. "That is why I called you," he said quietly. "Because sometimes the most important part of a hotel is not the marble floor or the chandeliers above it." He gestured gently toward Lena. "Sometimes it is the person who keeps it shining." The words spoken by the silver-haired gentleman settled over the ballroom with a weight that no music could soften. Daniel Whitmore remained silent for several seconds, his eyes still resting on Lena Brooks as if measuring the quiet strength in the way she stood. Around them the guests shifted slightly in their chairs, sensing that the elegant evening had turned into something far more serious than a charity gala. Richard Caldwell cleared his throat, the sound sharp in the silence. He forced another tight smile and looked toward Daniel. "Sir, I assure you the situation is being exaggerated," he said carefully. "Miss Brooks is a dependable employee, and I was only maintaining standards in front of our guests." Daniel Whitmore slowly turned his head toward him. His voice when he spoke was calm, but carried the quiet authority of someone used to being heard. "Maintaining standards," he repeated. "Is that what you call it?" Caldwell nodded quickly, though the confidence in his posture had begun to crumble. "Of course. This is a luxury hotel. Every detail matters." Daniel looked around the ballroom then, taking in the chandeliers, the marble floor, the neatly arranged tables filled with polished glass and silverware. The entire room represented elegance and reputation, yet the silence between the guests now felt heavier than the decorations. "You're correct," Daniel said slowly. "Every detail does matter." Then he turned back to Lena. "Miss Brooks," he continued gently, "you said you have worked here for 7 years. Lena nodded quietly. "Yes, sir." Daniel studied her for another moment. 7 years is a long time to serve in a place like this. "Do you enjoy the work?" Lena seemed surprised by the question. She glanced briefly toward the floor before answering. "Yes, sir. I do my best to keep the hotel clean for the guests." Daniel nodded slightly, but his expression did not soften. "And during those 7 years," he asked, "have you ever been written up for misconduct?" Caldwell opened his mouth quickly. "No, sir," he admitted before Lena could answer. "Her record is completely clean." A faint ripple moved through the nearby tables as several guests exchanged looks. The silver-haired gentleman remained standing calmly beside Daniel Whitmore, watching the exchange unfold exactly as he had expected. Daniel folded his hands behind his back and took a slow step across the marble floor, circling slightly as he spoke. 7 years, he repeated thoughtfully. "That means you were working here even before we renovated the East Wing." Lena looked up briefly, surprised that he knew the detail. "Yes, sir," she said softly. Daniel nodded once more. Then his gaze returned to Caldwell. "Richard," he said evenly, "do you know how many employees stay with a hotel for 7 years?" Caldwell hesitated. "I would imagine quite a few." Daniel shook his head slightly. "Very few. Hospitality is difficult work. Long hours. Little recognition. Most people leave within 2 years." The room remained silent as the meaning of his words slowly settled in. Daniel stopped walking and faced Caldwell directly. "So, when someone remains loyal for 7 years, that tells me something important about that person." Caldwell shifted uncomfortably. "Yes, sir," he murmured. Daniel's voice remained steady. "It tells me they care about this place." He turned again toward Lena, his expression thoughtful. "And it tells me they care about the people who walk through these doors." Lena did not know how to respond. She simply nodded again, her hands still folded quietly in front of her uniform. The silver-haired gentleman smiled faintly. "That is exactly what I saw earlier," he said. While others were enjoying their dinner, she was making sure no one slipped on the floor. Several guests nodded subtly in agreement, remembering the moment clearly now. Caldwell felt the pressure building around him like a tightening circle. He forced another uneasy laugh. Again, it was a minor issue that has already been resolved. Daniel Whitmore looked at him steadily for several seconds. Then he spoke in a tone that carried through the entire ballroom. "Resolved," he repeated. "Not quite." His gaze moved slowly across the room, meeting the eyes of several witnesses who had seen the earlier humiliation. Finally, his attention returned to Lena Brooks. The owner of the Whitmore Grand Hotel took one quiet step closer to her, and the guests leaned forward slightly in their chairs, sensing that the evening was about to change in a way none of them had expected. Daniel Whitmore stopped just a few steps in front of Lena Brooks, and for a moment neither of them spoke. The entire ballroom seemed to hold its breath. The golden chandeliers reflected in the polished marble floor beneath their feet, and the soft music from the band had faded almost completely as the musicians quietly lowered their instruments. Lena could feel the attention of every guest in the room pressing against her shoulders, but Daniel's expression remained calm and focused as he looked at her. Then something unexpected happened. Daniel Whitmore extended his hand slowly toward Lena. At first she thought he might be asking for something, perhaps the cleaning cloth she still held folded between her fingers. Instead, he stepped forward and gently pulled her into a brief but sincere embrace. The movement was simple and quiet, yet it sent a wave of astonishment through the room. Several guests gasped softly. Others stared in open disbelief. Richard Caldwell froze where he stood, his face losing color as he watched the owner of the Whitmore Grand Hotel hug the very housekeeper he had mocked earlier that evening. Lena herself looked stunned. She stood still for a moment before Daniel stepped back again. His voice, when he spoke, was steady but filled with quiet emotion. 7 years ago, he said slowly, so that the entire ballroom could hear, my mother visited this hotel for the first time after her surgery. A ripple of curiosity moved through the nearby tables as the guests listened. Daniel continued. She was still weak. Walking was difficult. She spilled a glass of water in the hallway outside the East Wing elevators. Lena's eyes widened slightly as the memory returned to her. Daniel nodded when he saw the recognition in her expression. Yes, he said softly. You remember. The room remained completely silent as he continued speaking. Most people walked past her that day. They were busy. They were late for meetings or dinner reservations. But one employee stopped to help her. You brought her a chair. You cleaned the floor so she would not slip. And you stayed with her until she felt strong enough to stand again. Lena lowered her eyes, clearly uncomfortable with the sudden attention. It was just my job, sir, she said quietly. Daniel shook his head gently. No, he replied. It was kindness. Several guests near the front tables nodded slowly as they listened. The silver-haired gentleman smiled faintly, clearly satisfied that the truth had finally reached the center of the room. Daniel turned slightly so that the entire ballroom could see Lena standing beside him. My mother told me about that moment when she returned home, he continued. She said the hotel was beautiful, but what impressed her most was the woman who helped her without expecting anything in return. The murmurs among the guests grew louder now, though the atmosphere carried a sense of respect rather than gossip. Richard Caldwell stood frozen several feet away, his earlier confidence completely gone. Daniel Whitmore's voice remained calm as he spoke again. That same woman has spent 7 years helping guests who never learn her name, he said. She has cleaned the floors that all of us walk on. She has made this hotel look perfect for the people who come here to celebrate. He paused for a moment and then looked directly at Caldwell. And tonight she was mocked for doing exactly that. The words landed heavily in the quiet ballroom. Caldwell swallowed and attempted to speak. Sir, I truly meant no disrespect, he said quickly. It was only a misunderstanding during a busy evening. Daniel did not raise his voice. Instead, he simply looked at the manager for several long seconds. Respect, he said slowly, is not measured by how we treat important guests. He gestured gently toward Lena. It is measured by how we treat the people who work beside us every day. The room fell silent once more. Lena stood quietly with her hands folded in front of her uniform, clearly wishing the attention would fade. Yet the atmosphere in the ballroom had changed completely. What had begun as a moment of humiliation had now turned into something far more powerful, and every person in the room understood that the evening was no longer about the gala dinner or the elegant surroundings. It had become a lesson that none of them would easily forget. The quiet after Daniel Whitmore's words seemed to stretch across the ballroom like a held breath that no one wanted to break. Guests who had arrived expecting an elegant evening now sat perfectly still in their chairs, watching a moment of truth unfold beneath the chandeliers. Lena Brooks remained beside Daniel, her eyes lowered slightly, clearly uncomfortable with the sudden attention. For years she had moved through these halls, almost invisible to the guests who filled the hotel. Now every person in the room seemed to know her name. Richard Caldwell stood several steps away, his earlier confidence gone. The polished smile that had once come so easily now struggled to return to his face. He straightened his jacket and forced himself to speak again, though his voice lacked the authority it had carried earlier in the evening. Sir, Caldwell said carefully, addressing Daniel Whitmore. If I gave the wrong impression earlier, I apologize. I never intended to embarrass anyone. A few guests exchanged quiet looks. The apology sounded rehearsed, as though he were trying to repair something that had already broken. Daniel Whitmore did not respond immediately. Instead, he turned slightly and looked around the ballroom again, taking in the silent tables, the attentive faces, and the shining marble floor that reflected every light above them. This hotel, he said calmly after a moment, was built on the idea that every guest should feel welcome the moment they walked through those doors. His voice carried clearly across the room. But that promise does not only apply to guests. Several people nodded slowly, understanding where his words were leading. Daniel continued speaking, his tone thoughtful rather than angry. A hotel is not only walls and chandeliers. It is people. The people who greet visitors at the front desk. The people who prepare the meals in the kitchen. The people who clean the floors after everyone else has gone home. He paused and looked toward Lena again. And sometimes those people show more character than the ones who claim to lead them. The silver-haired gentleman who had first spoken earlier folded his arms with quiet satisfaction. Around the room, the guests remained attentive, sensing that the evening had become something larger than a simple misunderstanding. Caldwell shifted again, clearly uncomfortable under the growing weight of attention. "Sir," he said cautiously, "I fully respect the employees who work here. I simply maintain high standards for the hotel reputation." Daniel Whitmore gave a small nod. "Standards are important," he agreed. "But dignity is more important." The room grew even quieter as he continued. "Earlier tonight, the dignity of a loyal employee was challenged in front of guests. That is not the standard I expect from leadership in this building." Caldwell opened his mouth to answer, then closed it again when he realized the entire room was watching him. Lena stood silently, wishing the moment would pass so she could return to the quiet hallway where no one paid attention to her work. Yet something in Daniel's expression softened slightly as he looked at her again. "Miss Brooks," he said gently, "you said earlier that helping my mother was simply your job." Lena nodded. "Yes, sir." Daniel shook his head slowly. "No one asked you to stay beside her until she felt better. That was not written in any employee handbook." A few guests smiled quietly at the thought. Daniel turned slightly so the entire room could hear his next words. "That day my mother told me something I have never forgotten," he said. "She said the strength of a hotel is not measured by how expensive the rooms are. It is measured by the kindness of the people who work there." The silver-haired gentleman nodded with approval. Around the room, the guests listened carefully, many of them recognizing the truth behind the statement. Daniel Whitmore finally turned back toward Richard Caldwell. His voice remained calm, but carried a firmness that left no doubt about his meaning. "And leadership," he said slowly, "is measured by how we treat the people who carry that kindness every day." Caldwell lowered his eyes briefly, understanding that the room had already reached its own conclusion about what had happened earlier in the evening. The gala music began again quietly in the background, but the atmosphere had changed completely. What had once been a simple dinner gathering had now become a powerful reminder that respect could not be polished like marble or arranged like table settings. It had to be practiced, especially by those who believed they held the most authority. The quiet music that had begun playing again in the background did little to ease the tension that remained in the ballroom. Guests sat straighter in their chairs, their attention still centered on the small group standing on the marble floor beneath the chandeliers. Lena Brooks stood quietly beside Daniel Whitmore, her hands folded as she tried to keep her breathing steady. She had spent years working in this hotel without anyone truly noticing her presence. Now it felt as though every pair of eyes in the room followed even the smallest movement she made. Daniel Whitmore slowly turned his attention back toward Richard Caldwell. His voice remained calm, yet the firmness behind it carried through the entire ballroom. "Richard," he said, "you spoke earlier about maintaining standards." Caldwell nodded cautiously. "Yes, sir." Daniel took a slow step across the polished floor before continuing. "Standards are not simply about presentation or perfection. They're about the example set by the people responsible for leading others." Several guests nodded quietly in agreement. The silver-haired gentleman who had first spoken earlier remained standing nearby, his posture relaxed now that the truth had been spoken openly. Caldwell felt the pressure of the room building around him. He shifted his weight slightly and attempted to regain his composure. "Sir, I understand the importance of leadership," he replied carefully. "And I assure you, I have always tried to represent the hotel with professionalism." Daniel studied him for a moment before answering. "Professionalism also includes respect." The words were not loud, but they carried clearly through the silent ballroom. Caldwell lowered his eyes briefly before speaking again. "If my words earlier seemed harsh, I regret that. It was never my intention to insult anyone." Lena glanced briefly toward him, surprised. to hear the change in his tone. Only a short time earlier he had spoken to her with sharp authority in front of the same room of guests. Now the confidence in his voice had softened considerably. Daniel Whitmore remained thoughtful for a moment before responding. An apology is a good beginning, he said calmly. But leadership requires more than that. He turned slightly toward the guests seated around the room. Many of you here tonight manage companies or lead teams of your own, he said. You understand that the culture of any organization is shaped by the way its leaders behave when they think no one important is watching. Several guests exchanged knowing looks. The statement carried a truth that applied far beyond the walls of the hotel. Daniel then turned back toward Caldwell. Tonight you believed you were correcting a small problem, he said. But the way you handled it created a much larger one. Caldwell swallowed quietly, realizing that the attention of the entire room had shifted to him. Sir, he said slowly, I accept responsibility for my words. Daniel nodded once, acknowledging the statement. The tension in the room softened slightly as the guests sensed that the moment was moving toward resolution. Yet Daniel had not finished speaking. The Whitmore Grand Hotel has always been known for its hospitality, he continued. That reputation does not come from marble floors or expensive chandeliers. It comes from the people who work here every day. His gaze moved briefly toward Lena again. People who treat guests with patience, kindness, and care. Lena shifted slightly, clearly uncomfortable being mentioned again in front of so many strangers. Daniel noticed the movement and softened his voice slightly. Miss Brooks, he said gently, you showed those qualities long before anyone here noticed. A few guests began to applaud quietly, the sound spreading slowly across the ballroom until it filled the room with a warm ripple of appreciation. Lena looked surprised by the reaction and lowered her head again, clearly unsure how to respond. Caldwell stood silently as the applause faded. For the first time that evening, he seemed to fully understand how the moment had shifted beyond his control. Daniel Whitmore looked at him once more. Richard, he said calmly, I expect the leaders in this building to set an example that reflects the values of this hotel. Caldwell nodded immediately. Of course. Sir. Daniel held his gaze for a moment longer before speaking his final words on the matter. Then starting tonight, he said quietly, that example will begin with how we treat the people who make this place what it is. The statement hung in the air like a quiet conclusion. Around the ballroom, the guests began to relax again, sensing that the difficult moment had reached its turning point. Yet for Lena Brooks, the evening still felt unreal. She had come to work expecting another ordinary shift cleaning floors and wiping tables. Instead, she now stood beside the owner of the hotel while an entire ballroom of guests watched a lesson in respect unfold around her. The applause that had begun softly in the ballroom slowly faded, leaving behind a calmer and more thoughtful silence. Guests returned their hands to the tables, though many of them still watched Lena Brooks with quiet respect. The moment had changed the mood of the evening in a way no one could ignore. What had begun as a celebration now felt more like a reflection on the values that truly define the place. Daniel Whitmore remained standing beside Lena for another moment before stepping slightly forward so that his voice carried clearly to the entire room. Thank you for your patience this evening, he said calmly to the guests. Sometimes a hotel must pause for a moment to remember what it stands for. Several people nodded in agreement. The silver-haired gentleman returned to his seat with a satisfied expression, folding his hands on the table as though his part in the evening had been completed. Richard Caldwell stood quietly near the center of the ballroom. The polished confidence that once defined his posture had been replaced by a more humble stillness. He knew that every person in the room had witnessed the lesson that had just unfolded. Daniel Whitmore turned toward him again, though his tone now carried less tension and more finality. Richard, he said, leadership is not proven during easy moments. It is revealed during difficult ones. Caldwell nodded slowly. Yes, sir, he replied. Daniel paused briefly before continuing. I believe you understand that now. Caldwell lowered his gaze. Edo. For a moment the room remained still, as if waiting to see what would happen next. Then Daniel turned toward Lena again. His expression softened in a way that surprised several guests. "Miss Brooks," he said gently, "you have spent 7 years helping this hotel succeed." Lena looked slightly embarrassed by the attention and responded quietly, "I only try to do my work well, sir." Daniel nodded, and that is exactly why the work matters. He looked across the ballroom again before speaking once more. Every great hotel depends on people who care about the small details others overlook. Several guests murmured their agreement. Daniel continued, "Cleaning a spill before someone slips. Helping a guest who needs a moment to rest. These things may seem small, but they're the moments that guests remember." Lena remained silent, though the faintest hint of a smile appeared as she listened. Daniel Whitmore then addressed the room again. "Many of you here tonight are leaders in your own organizations," he said. "You know that success is not built only by those who stand in front. It is built by those who work quietly behind the scenes." The statement drew another wave of respectful applause from the guests. Even the musicians near the stage smiled quietly as they watched the scene unfold. Daniel finally turned back to Lena. "Miss Brooks," he said, "I would like to thank you personally for the kindness you show my mother and for the years you have dedicated to this hotel." Lena lifted her eyes slightly. "Thank you, sir," she replied softly. Daniel nodded once before taking a step back, allowing the attention of the room to settle naturally again. The tension that had filled the ballroom earlier now gave way to a sense of warmth that spread slowly through the crowd. Conversations began again, though they carried a new tone of respect. Richard Caldwell approached Lena quietly. His voice, when he spoke, was careful and sincere. "Miss Brooks," he said, "I owe you an apology." Lena looked up at him with quiet surprise. "There was no need for my words earlier," Caldwell continued. "You were simply doing your job." Lena gave a small nod. "Thank you, sir," she replied gently. The exchange was brief but meaningful. Around them, the gala atmosphere slowly returned as waiters moved between tables and the band resumed its music. Yet everyone in the room understood that something important had just taken place. The Whitmore Grand Hotel ballroom once again glowed with light and conversation, but beneath the elegant surface a deeper message had settled into the memory of every guest present. Respect, they realized, was not a decoration that could be placed on a table. It was something that had to be lived every day by the people who shared the same space, whether they wore expensive suits or simple housekeeping uniforms. The music in the ballroom slowly rose again, smooth and elegant, as waiters resumed moving between the tables with trays of sparkling water and polished silver dishes. Conversations returned in quiet waves, yet the atmosphere remained different from earlier in the evening. Something thoughtful had settled over the guests. The moment that had unfolded near the center of the room had left an impression that no decoration or speech could replace. Lena Brooks stood for a moment longer near the marble floor where everything had happened. She felt slightly overwhelmed by the attention and quietly stepped back toward the service corridor, hoping to return to the work that had always been comfortable and familiar to her. Daniel Whitmore noticed the movement and spoke before she could slip away unnoticed. "Miss Brooks," he said gently. Lena paused and turned back. "Yes, sir." Daniel walked a few steps closer, his voice calm but sincere. "Before you return to work, there is one more thing I would like to say." The nearby guests grew quiet again, sensing that the evening had not yet reached its final moment. Daniel Whitmore looked across the ballroom as he spoke, allowing everyone present to hear his words. "A hotel can only succeed when the people who work inside it feel valued," he said slowly. "Without them, the lights would shine on empty rooms and silent hallways." Several guests nodded quietly. The silver-haired gentleman smiled as he listened, clearly pleased that the message of the evening was continuing to unfold. Daniel then turned back to Lena. "You said earlier that helping my mother was simply your job," he said. "But kindness is never just a job." Lena lowered her eyes slightly. "I only wanted to make sure she was all right," she replied softly. Daniel nodded. "Exactly," he said. "You saw someone who needed help, and you stayed until she felt safe again. That kind of character cannot be taught in a training manual." The words seemed to settle warmly through the room. Daniel continued speaking so that the entire ballroom could hear him clearly. For 7 years, you have shown that same care to this hotel and the people who visit it. He paused for a moment before adding quietly, that deserves more than simple recognition. Lena looked surprised. Sir, that is not necessary, she said gently. Daniel Whitmore smiled slightly. Sometimes the most necessary things are the ones we forget to do, he replied. He turned briefly toward Richard Caldwell, who still stood nearby with a far more humble posture than earlier in the evening. Richard, Daniel said calmly, please make a note that Miss Brooks will receive a promotion to guest relations supervisor beginning next month. A soft murmur moved through the room. Lena looked completely stunned. Sir, she said quietly, clearly unsure she had heard correctly, I have never worked at the front desk. Daniel gave a reassuring nod. You already understand the most important part of that job, he replied, caring about the people who walk through the doors. The guests began to applaud again, this time with a warm enthusiasm that filled the ballroom. Even the musicians on the small stage tapped their instruments lightly against the floor in approval. Lena felt her cheeks grow warm as she stood in the center of the attention she had never expected. Richard Caldwell stepped forward again and spoke carefully. Congratulations, Miss Brooks, he said sincerely. You have earned it. Lena nodded politely. Thank you, she answered. Daniel Whitmore then looked around the ballroom one final time. Tonight we gathered here to celebrate success, he said calmly. But sometimes success means remembering the people who helped create it. The guests continued applauding softly as Lena stepped back once more, still overwhelmed but quietly grateful. The evening gala gradually returned to its elegant rhythm. Yet every person in the Whitmore Grand Hotel ballroom knew they had witnessed something far more meaningful than a typical dinner event. They had seen a moment when quiet dedication was finally recognized, and the lesson it carried would remain with them long after the lights of the ballroom faded into the night. The applause in the Whitmore Grand Hotel ballroom slowly softened into warm conversation as the evening resumed its elegant rhythm. The musicians returned to their gentle melody, and waiters moved again between the tables carrying polished trays beneath the golden glow of the chandeliers. Yet the atmosphere had changed in a way that everyone could feel. The guests were no longer simply attending a gala dinner. They had witnessed a moment that reminded them why places like this existed in the first place. Lena Brooks stood quietly near the edge of the marble floor, still holding the folded cleaning cloth she had carried with her earlier in the evening. Everything that had happened felt almost unreal. Only a short time ago, she had been kneeling on this same floor, wiping away a small spill while trying to avoid the attention of the room. Now the same room had applauded her dedication and kindness. Daniel Whitmore stepped beside her one last time before returning to greet the guests. His voice was calm and warm. Miss Brooks, he said gently, tomorrow morning the Human Resources Office will help you begin your transition to your new role. I believe the hotel guests will appreciate meeting the person who has been quietly taking care of them all these years. Lena nodded with a grateful smile. Thank you, sir, she said softly. Daniel gave a small, respectful nod before turning back toward the tables where several guests were waiting to speak with him. The silver-haired gentleman who had first defended Lena earlier walked past her on his way toward the exit. As he passed, he paused briefly and spoke in a kind voice. You reminded everyone here tonight what real hospitality looks like, he said. Lena looked slightly embarrassed by the praise, but nodded politely. I was only doing my job, she replied. The gentleman smiled gently. Sometimes doing your job with heart is the rarest thing in the world. With that, he continued, walking toward the doors as the evening gradually returned to its relaxed flow. A few minutes later, Lena stepped quietly into the service corridor once again. The fluorescent lights hummed softly above the gray carpet, and a familiar scent of cleaning supplies filled the air. Rosa looked up from a supply cart as Lena approached. What happened out there? She asked with wide eyes. Lena gave a small laugh that still carried a hint of disbelief. I think my job just changed, she said softly. Rosa stared at her for a moment before breaking into a wide smile. Well then, she said, this hallway is going to feel strange without you. Lena looked down the corridor she had walked so many nights during the past 7 years. The carts, the folded towels, and the quiet routine had been her world for a long time. Yet she knew something important had shifted. Not just for her, but for the people who had watched the evening unfold. Back in the ballroom, the guests continued their dinner with a new sense of warmth and reflection. Richard Caldwell moved among the tables again, though his manner was noticeably more thoughtful than before. Every step he took across the polished floor seemed guided by the lesson he had learned in front of everyone that night. Near the stage, Daniel Whitmore paused briefly and looked across the ballroom one last time. The marble floors shone beneath the chandeliers. The music drifted through the air, and the hotel once again looked exactly as it always had. Yet something had changed in the hearts of the people inside it. Because sometimes a building does not reveal its true character through luxury or decoration. Sometimes it reveals it through the quiet dignity of a person who simply chooses kindness, even when no one is watching. Lena Brooks had spent years working silently behind the scenes of the Whitmore Grand Hotel. But on that evening, in front of an entire ballroom of guests, she reminded everyone that respect is not given to titles or expensive suits. Respect belongs to those who treat others with humanity. And that was a lesson the Whitmore Grand Hotel would never forget.